And we're finally back for another one of these weekly power rankings. It's been a couple weeks since I did one of these, missing the last two. It's now week 25 edition, I want to say, missing weeks 23 and 24. The first one, there was a Kraken game, and then they've been every other day for a while and busy outside of it, so it's hard to sneak into power rankings there. And then last week, unfortunately, I got food poisoning and barely managed to get through a couple of R&Rs while getting over that, so it's taken a while, but we're back with another power rankings, and with it having been a couple weeks, and the last one, well, let's just say there were a couple of fan bases pretty upset. I've decided to just come completely fresh at this one, not really even think about how I had them ranked last time. That having been said, though, as I was going through it, it turns out that, once again, I think I was actually right for the most part. I do have to admit that Colorado and Edmonton were probably a little bit too low the last time I did these power rankings, maybe not first and second like the fan bases of those teams expected. And anyway, with that, let's get right into it with a couple of teams that I don't know if I really want to put them as honorable mentions, but what the heck, we'll throw them in here. I'm gonna have two as a group for the first honorable mention, that being the LA Kings and the Vegas Golden Knights. Either one of which I think, I mean, maybe if they ran the table, they would find their way into the power rankings for the last week of them. But at the same time, both of these teams are playing very well, both having won 7 of their last 10 games, going hot into the playoffs, and even if they are fighting over which team is going to be the third in the Pacific and which is going to be a wild card team, they're getting hot at the right time, and both could be dangerous come the postseason. Then with the other honorable mention, this is where it did come down to a tight race between two teams to see who got 10th and who got this second honorable mention spot, or maybe the first one, depending on how you want to look at it. Basically, the 11th ranked team. For me, it's the Toronto Maple Leafs. And it was basically between them and, spoiler for who's in 10th, the Tampa Bay Lightning, as to which was going to get this spot. And yes, the Leafs are ahead of the Lightning by 4 points in the standings, with one fewer game having been played, so still in a pretty good spot with just a few games left to take that third spot in the division and not have to face a team via the wild card. But at the same time, the Lightning have been playing a little bit better here of late, and it did kind of come down then to me of a head-to-head between the two teams, which the Lightning did win that recently 4-1 over Toronto. But for the Leafs, at this point, basically all eyes are on Austin Matthews anyway. They know they're headed to the playoffs, and then it's just whether or not they're facing Florida or Boston in the first round. So yeah, then all eyes are definitely on whether or not Austin Matthews can hit 70 goals by the end of the season. And with 6 games left, he's 6 away, which means he's not quite on pace to make 70, but at the same time, he's more than capable of scoring that number of goals in, well, heck, even 3 games, much less 6. We've seen him do it a number of times even this season. So it'll be an interesting last few games to see whether or not he can get there, and then see which one of pretty much guaranteed those two teams they face in the first round. Also, it's actually worth mentioning that Samsonov, after everything that's happened this season, a season that looked at one point like it could be the last of his NHL career, now he could very well be the starter going into the playoffs for this team. Moving into the 10th spot though, and again, these teams basically have the same jerseys, so they might as well be right next to each other. It is, again, the Tampa Bay Lightning, a team that is getting hot at the right time, having not only won 7 of their last 10, but 10 of their last 13, with one of those 3 losses being an overtime loss to the Kings, another team, like I already said, that's hot and headed into the playoffs in the right way. And the other 2 losses, one of them was in their last game to the Pittsburgh Penguins, who are trying to have a miracle happen to get into one of the wildcard spots themselves. And then also the Detroit Red Wings, who are likewise doing the same thing. But on the flip side, in the last 3 weeks, to have some of those 10 wins coming against teams like New York, actually both New York teams, but specifically I'm talking about the Rangers, Florida, Boston, Vegas, and Toronto, it's been a pretty good stretch for them, not only getting 10 wins, but a lot of wins against teams headed to the postseason. And it also has to help inspire confidence that for the Lightning, not only is the team getting hot at the right time, but their best players are doing a lot of the work, with Vasilevsky having given up just 1 goal in 3 of his last 5 starts, including the games against Toronto and Boston, as well as the other one being against the Islanders, and Stamkos and Kucherov playing well like you'd expect Stamkos and Kucherov to play, especially once we get into the postseason. So then again, with the Lightning, as was the case with Toronto, not only are they actually also watching the offensive race of one of their players, in this case Kucherov, to see whether or not he can have the lead in points at the end of the season. Currently a 5-point lead over Nathan MacKinnon, then 1 back of him is Connor McDavid, so still a tight race between the 3 of them, but Kucherov has the lead. They, too, also are waiting to see whether or not they'll get Boston or Florida for their matchup in the first round. Not necessarily guaranteed it'll be one of those 2, but much more likely than not, as at least at this point anyway, it seems like the Rangers are likely to get the first seed in the East, and whichever one of Toronto or Tampa Bay doesn't get the third spot is going to get the first wildcard spot, meaning they'd face whichever team wins the division, and that comes down to either Florida or Boston. And speaking of those Florida Panthers, in the ninth spot, this is where I have them. And honestly, this is a team that I still, for whatever reason, do think is a better team than the ninth spot would suggest. It's a team that I would expect to probably make it out of the first round, barring any bad injuries here at the end of the season. But there's no denying the fact that after an incredible month of February and first half of March, about midway through March, it really has fallen apart for them as they've only won 3 of their last 12 games. And while a lot of those 9 losses have been against playoff teams, a couple against Boston, the Rangers, Tampa Bay and Toronto are both in there, as well as Nashville. And at the same time, while you're losing to good opponents, you're gonna have to beat a good opponent once the playoffs roll around. Or for that matter, beat 4 good opponents if you're really trying to get where you want to go. And since we're on the subject of the playoffs anyway, when it comes to what the problem has been here for the Panthers lately, it seems like it might be goaltending, as the common thread between all 9 of those losses is that they gave up 3 or more goals in all of those games. Meanwhile, the 3 wins, they gave up 2 or fewer. So for the Panthers, especially when it comes to the playoffs and the fact that goaltending often can determine how far a team goes, they're going to need Bob to get things back to where he was for the majority of the season if they want to make that deep run for a second year in a row, and this time get those last 3 wins. And while we're on the subject of goaltending, moving into the 8th spot, this is where I have a team that certainly doesn't have an issue with the goaltending part of it in the Winnipeg Jets, where Hellebuck, to me, is the absolute runaway for the Vezina. And while the last couple of weeks have been a little bit hit and miss, I don't have any doubt that Hellebuck will be the strength of this team come the postseason. The question then for them will pretty obviously then be whether or not they can score enough goals consistently enough at the other end to get them the wins they need to make that deep playoff run that they and their fans would desperately like to see. Which, as far as that's concerned, yes, it's true that things have been going pretty well for the Jets when it comes to scoring goals over their last 3 games, having scored 4 or more goals in each of the last 3, and I'm definitely expecting that with that there will be some Jets fans up in arms in the comments about how the Jets don't deserve to be all the way down in 8th, having won each of their last 3 straight, one of those against a Kings team that, like we already said, has been playing pretty good hockey lately, especially defensively, so to score 4 against them is kind of impressive. At the same time, though, with this having been a few weeks since I've done a power rankings, I'm not just looking at the last week, we're looking at the last few weeks, and while things did go well for the Jets in the last 3 games, they were coming off a 6-game losing skid. So yeah, it's been a bit hit or miss over the last few weeks for the Jets, and all of that rounds into an 8th, but trending upwards. And honestly, I did think about bumping the Jets up a couple spots just for how good Hellebuck's been, but even he was a part of that losing skid. Meanwhile, in the 7th spot, I have a team that's done a little bit better record-wise than the Jets over this last stretch, but unlike the Jets, is not trending in the right direction, having lost 4 of their last 6 games. And for the Vancouver Canucks, it's not just that they've been losing a little bit more consistently than you'd like heading into the playoffs, it's who they've been losing to. As over their last 11 games, while they have won almost half of those, 5 wins in the last 11, all 5 of those have come against not just teams that aren't in the playoffs, but teams that are, for the most part, already eliminated from playoff contention. Meanwhile, the 6 losses are all but one against playoff-bound teams, the one exception being the Capitals, who are still in that hunt of teams that are basically playing hot potato with that second wildcard spot in the East. So again, like I already said with the Panthers, it comes down to that similar thing where it's great that they're still getting wins here and there, but they need to be able to actually beat good teams once the postseason rolls around, since whoever they face is going to be at least a pretty decent team, and if they want to make a deep run, they're going to have to beat consistently some very good opponents, and they just have not been doing that over the last few weeks. Now, obviously, some of that comes with the caveat that the struggles of beating better teams here for the Canucks came almost exactly when Demko left due to the injuries. So if they can get Demko back for the postseason and hopefully for a couple games before it so he can get warmed up before jumping right into playoff hockey, then maybe that helps quell some of those concerns. But all the same, if he were to get re-injured or for some reason isn't able to come back for part of the first round, yeah, it's definitely not where you want to be, not to mention the fact that if they continue to scuffle their way through these last few games and Edmonton heats up, they could very well play their way out of that top spot in the Pacific. And speaking of that top spot in the Pacific, in the 6th spot, I have the team that could take it from them in the Edmonton Oilers. Now, for the Oilers, there's some concerns as well here and there. It certainly doesn't seem like things are fully gelling on the bench, with Corey Perry yelling at Evander Kane. Not that he's the first one to yell at Kane for doing boneheaded things. And while a 6-3-1 record over the last couple weeks is not anything to write home about either, it's still been enough for them to catch up a few points on the Canucks, and with still one game against Vancouver left in their last few games, as well as 3 of their last 6 against Arizona, and San Jose, they definitely could find their way into that top spot in the Pacific if the Canucks can't find a way to beat some playoff eligible teams. Especially considering too that Edmonton has not had those same problems, as 3 of those 6 wins in the last couple weeks have come against LA, Winnipeg, and Colorado. At least 2 of those are teams above them in the standings. Anyway, all that to say, at least right now, it seems like Edmonton is the type of team that's poised to find their way out of the first round, while Vancouver, granted again the whole Demko being out thing, they're looking like a team that could find their way out in the first round if they can't find a way to play better against those good teams. And for the last stretch, I wouldn't put my money against Edmonton being able to jump into that top spot and win the Pacific Division. Moving on though into the top 5, in the 5th spot, I have the Colorado Avalanche. For the Avalanche, I mean, maybe rightly so, but the last time I did these power rankings, they were just starting to heat up, and there were a lot of people up in arms about the Avalanche being too low on the list. A lot of the types of people that think these weekly power rankings are power rankings for just what happened in that single week and not the grand scope of the season and how the team's been playing in general, with maybe a little bit lean to what's happened recently. Either way, the Avalanche did rattle off 9 straight wins, and if I had kept doing these, they would have found their way up towards the top of this list. Maybe not first place, but certainly within the top 3 for at least one of the weeks. But then the last 2 weeks happened, and well, the Avalanche have only won 2 of their last 7 games. So if anything at this point, for the people that think these power rankings are just the one specific week, the Avalanche maybe don't even belong on this list the way that they've been playing lately. And obviously some of that has to do with injuries. This is definitely not the healthiest team. Their injury list is somewhat extensive, but at the same time, a lot of the top players are in there, with the exception of Rantanen did miss this last game against the Stars. Even still though, the last 2 games have to be a little bit concerning, especially with Georgiev in net, considering they gave up 13 goals in just those 2 games, giving up 6 to the Oilers and then 7 to the Stars. And real quick, while we're here and on the subject, since I know it's going to end up in the comment section and probably will even with me saying this, yes, I'm aware that the Oilers are 1 spot below the Avalanche after having recently blown them out 6-2, but that win helped close the gap between the 2 teams, and it didn't seem like quite enough to bounce them over the Avalanche, though I can see where people will probably feel like just because of that 1 game, the Oilers should move up the list. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work how you can move teams above other teams just because of 1 head-to-head game. Otherwise, the Senators might be above the Oilers, for example, since they lost to them somewhat recently. Anyway, moving on, for the Avalanche, it also probably has to suck a little bit that, and this is something I was kind of hoping would just last the entire season, with their loss earlier on, and a pretty close loss against a good Rangers team, a 2-1 shootout loss, it did mark the end of the home point streak for Nathan MacKinnon that had lasted the entire season up to that point and just came a few games away from going all 41 home games. With, funny enough, until that game against the Rangers, the last team that held Nathan MacKinnon pointless in Colorado being the Seattle Kraken in Game 2 of the first round last year. So, I mean, if nothing else, I was hoping that MacKinnon could go the entire season, not only because I do like the Avalanche and MacKinnon, but also because it would be fun to keep that stat about the Kraken being the last team to hold him pointless at home going a little bit longer. But anyway, moving on into the top 4, where I do feel like there's a bit of a gap, at least right now, between these top 4 and the rest of the pack. In the 4th spot, I have the Carolina Hurricanes. Now, to me, this is another case where it was very close between they and Boston for who would be in the 4th and who would be in the 3rd spot, kind of like with Toronto and Tampa Bay down in 10th and honorable mention, and it just came down to a recent head-to-head between the 2 teams. So again, this is the difference between the Colorado-Edmonton situation, where that head-to-head closed the gap, versus 2 teams here that were pretty close, and Boston wins that game against Carolina 4-1. So Carolina ends up in the 4th spot, but all that aside, and they will have a chance to avenge that loss to the Bruins coming up in their next game here on Tuesday. This is still a very good Carolina Hurricanes team, and 5-on-5, they are the best and most balanced team, the best team defensively and one of the best teams offensively, as I've said a couple of times, but a very good team at 5-on-5 skating. And while the goaltending has been a question mark all season and definitely will be something to watch in the postseason, and might be the reason that some people won't have them going as far in the playoffs as I probably will when it comes to doing my playoff bracket, it's going to be pretty tough for me to pick between they and the New York Rangers as to which team comes out of the division and goes to the Eastern Conference Finals. Right now, honestly, I'm probably leaning towards picking the Canes, especially considering when it comes to that question mark that I said they might have in goal. Well, they have 3 shutouts in their last 5 games, so it doesn't seem to be much of a question mark at this point in time anyway. And even if their 5-on-5 metrics and the quality of goaltending that they've been getting, especially lately, isn't enough to convince you that this team maybe even has an argument to be made for being the best in the NHL, their special teams outside of 5-on-5 are the best in the NHL combined between their power play and penalty kill, where their penalty kill is straight up the best in the NHL and their power play is the second best. So this is a team that really has it in just about every possible way and is going to be a very tough out come the postseason. But again, even if they do have the at least slight statistical edge on the Bruins in just about every way, the one place the Bruins have the edge, even aside from that head-to-head matchup where they did win recently and ultimately is the reason they have the Bruins in 3rd here over the Hurricanes, the Bruins do have 2 more points in the standings with the same number of games played, so whatever they've been doing has gotten them at least that 1 more win worth of points. Now, in the long run, that doesn't really matter between these 2 teams. They're not going to face each other in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs. They'd have to both make it to the conference final if they were going to face each other there. Still, the Bruins have had a very good season following up that incredible historic season, and who knows, maybe for the less statistically or at least more superstitiously minded among us, not winning the President's Trophy this year might help them do a little bit better in the postseason. As far as that's concerned, they're not out of the running for the President's Trophy, just 3 points behind the currently leading New York Rangers and tied with the Dallas Stars. Regardless, for the Bruins, it's a 2nd straight season of defying the mediocre expectations of most coming into it that they'd finally start to fall off this time now that a couple guys retired or left the team. No, they're once again one of the best teams in the NHL, a couple points away from maybe a 2nd President's Trophy in a row, and they're going to be a team that should be a tough out in the playoff, especially with that goaltending tandem that they have. And of course, unlike some of the other teams on this list, they too are getting hot at the right time, having won 7 of their last 10 games and the last 4 in a row, including the last 2 being that game against the Hurricanes and then beating the Panthers to help solidify that top spot in the division. So then that just leaves 2 teams left, the top 2 teams in the standings, and fittingly, the 2 hottest teams in the NHL, with the 2 best records over their last 10 games. And just for something different, in the 2nd spot, I'm going to go with the New York Rangers. Now, the Rangers are, like I said, currently 3 points ahead in the President's Trophy race, so as far as the standings are concerned, this is the best team in the NHL, and it's hard to argue between they or the Dallas Stars. And sure, while over the last couple weeks they have lost 1 more game than the Stars have, they did lose both of those games to at least teams that are competing for a playoff spot, if not in one, losing to Winnipeg and Pittsburgh, and then taking care of everyone else they faced, even if it did take overtime or the shootout, which they had 3 straight games of taking extra time, but still found the ways to win in all of those games. Like I mentioned earlier, they are the only team this season that has kept Nathan MacKinnon off of the score sheet in Colorado, which says something about how good this team can be defensively when they need to be, and how good they are in net, both things that become very important once you hit the postseason. And sure, like I mentioned before, it's true that they might not be a statistical darling when it comes to the advanced stats and the 5-on-5 expected goals for and against, where they're actually below NHL average in both of those categories, unlike just about every other team anywhere near them in the standings. They've still found ways to make it happen. Part of that certainly is the quietly incredible season of Artemi Panarin, who's really only not being talked about for the Hart because of the absolute runaway seasons of Kucherov, McKinnon, McDavid, and even that 70-goal potential season of Matthews. Still, Panarin's been great, and they have plenty of other ways to score, even if sometimes it's had to come in not the most statistically sustainable ways, or ways that advanced stats tend to like. But of course, as it turns out, and Vancouver fans can attest to this as well, it doesn't really matter what the advanced stats think when it comes to how you score, as long as you do score, and they've been doing enough of that to have the most wins of any team in the NHL, the only team currently with over 50 wins on the season. And besides, at this point, all their fans are probably really thinking about is who they're going to face in the first round, and when it comes to that, I'd say you have to like their chances of making it out of the first round, as they're more than likely going to face whichever one of those teams doing the thing at a stop sign where all four people get there at the same time and then say, you go, no, I insist, you please go. Anyway, like I said, a bunch of teams that are fighting over a spot that it doesn't really seem like any of them particularly want. One of them's going to end up facing the Rangers and probably end up on the couch by the second round. At the same time, though, I suppose we've thought that about teams before, like the Panthers last year or Columbus in 2019 against Tampa Bay. So you never know what happens in the playoffs, but yeah, the Rangers are in a good spot and a very good team. Really the only team playing potentially better than them at this point in time. Certainly the hottest team in the NHL when it comes to what have you done for me lately. With a 9-1 in their last 10 games, it's the Dallas Stars. Now, I did consider having the Stars in the second spot, and actually when I was writing the script for this earlier, I had them in the second spot and ended up moving them up because of their win over Colorado. And that's partly because the one loss in that last stretch is against the Chicago Blackhawks. So not the best loss, but it's just one in the last 9 games. And this is a team that, while it looks like it was going to be a tight 3-horse race coming down the stretch for who was going to win the Central Division, they've pretty much run away with that. It's not fully out of reach and they won't clinch it for another game or two, but playing the way that they are, they're not only going to clinch that top spot in the Central Division, also the top spot in the West, they're very likely to just clean go through the first round of the playoffs, as this team is playing some very good hockey. And it's not just that they're scoring goals, which they are doing plenty of that. It's mostly that they're doing a lot of the things that tend to be sustainable once you get to the postseason. Some good goaltending from Ottinger, and some very good defensive structure that makes it incredibly difficult for teams to even get offensive chances in the first place. In fact, for everything that you can say about the Avalanche giving up 7 goals to lose that game 7-4 here on Sunday night, the Avalanche were the first team in the last 10 games to score more than 3 goals on the Stars, as even that one loss to the Blackhawks was a 3-2 loss that once again featured some pretty good defense, and the goaltending's ultimately what let them down. It's really a game that you look at it and you think the Stars must have blown out the Blackhawks, outshooting them 44-17. Unfortunately, it just didn't really go their way when it came to the goaltending aspect of that particular game, but it was coming off of back-to-back shutouts, so again, a one-off is not anything to worry about too much. You can still win a playoff series 4-1. Plus, for what it's worth, playoff-wise, that one loss, the 3 goals let in and 17 shots to the Blackhawks, was a start for Wedgwood, so with Ottinger likely to start at least most, if not all, of the playoff games, yeah, he's been playing pretty well lately. But with all that, let me know what you think down in the comment section below if you haven't already, which teams you'd have in the top 10, what teams you'd move up, move down, any other honorable mentions that you feel like should be there. Obviously, Nashville's another team that had a huge hot streak and even was in the top 10, I think, the last time I did this, but they've started to slow down a little bit. They seem content with just holding on to that top wildcard spot in the West. Still another team that's been playing pretty well over the last month or so. Let me know what you think, and until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless. Thank you very much for sticking with me through the last 2 weeks of not doing this, and until the next one, as always, go Kraken. Or, I mean, try to get a top 10 pick, actually. It would be kind of nice if they could play well, but lose close games to get that better slot.